Okay, so at this point, we should be at a pretty familiar deal here with unemployment and wages. We've looked at a lot of stuff. So far, for example, we've taken the time to look at how we define the labor force, the supply and the demand of labor. We looked at why wages differ. So now we're going to look at the unemployment and what's really taking place. And a lot of this will be familiar, but I want to make sure that we get it concise and you get it understood, because unemployment is one of the three major macroeconomic topics that are discussed. And so that's one of the things that we'll focus on. So let's begin with a little bit of review just to make sure on a couple things. So remember, unemployment rate is a percentage of the labor force that is not working. It's not the percentage of the world's population or even the population in the United States. It's rather the labor force. So it's not the percentage of the population that is unemployed. It's rather it's that percentage of people who try to find a job but can't get one. Because remember, the labor force is really about 60% of the American population to begin with. So it consists of those 16 and older who are employed or are seeking employment. So there's a certain group of people. So if you're under 15, you're not in there. If you're not seeking employment, you're not a part of the labor force. So by default, some individuals are not in the labor force while others choose to be. So I'll give you an example. My wife could be in the labor force, but she's not because she's a stay-at-home mom. Those under 16 are automatically excluded. So sorry, 3-year-olds, you don't get a job. But so are those who are retired, who are military, institutionalized, and those who have not chosen to work. And by institutionalized, we're talking about prisons, mental homes, those types of places. So when we break that graph down and we look at it, reality, what we see, of course, is that our labor force is only a part of our graph here. So in 2010, you see the estimated population was 308 million. The labor force itself was about 153 million, and of those 139 million were working, 14.8 were not. So we can do the unemployment rate as the number of unemployed times 100 divided by a labor force times 100. So we're going to take that number and we're going to divide it by that number, and that gives us right here, you'll see 14,825 divided by 153,889 equals 0.096, so 9.6 unemployment. So really almost 10% of the labor force were unemployed. Now that does not mean that 10% of the population, but rather 10% of the labor force was unemployed. Okay, so first, you have to understand that there's 70.1 million people that are not in the labor force. So that means what we're looking at here, unemployed is 6.7 million. And then we see up here 135 million are employed. Now, that right there is the adult population, 211.9 million. So this data is a little bit older. What gives you the idea is here we have this adult population. We see who's not in the labor force, which is all the people that don't count for anything. Then we see the amount of people who are employed and the amount of people unemployed, and that's the labor force group. So the data is from 2001. Now just think about that for a second. The last data we did was 2010, and it was over 300 million people. So when we go back and look at 2001, we see there was 211.9 million people. 70.1 were not working in the labor force at all. They weren't even attempting to find jobs. Whereas 141.8 million were trying to find a job, but 6.7 could not do it. So you notice how those things are going to break down there. It's easy sometimes to look at that visual. Okay, so let's jump into this unemployment rate. So this is 1980 to 2012. So you notice the unemployment rate here. So we're starting here at about, like, say, a little over 7% in 1980, and then we move all the way here to 2012, and we'll see there that it's basically just over 8%. Now here's what's kind of bothersome, is you can see that in 1981 the unemployment rate was the exact same as it was in 2011. So that should tell you right there that what happens is it fluctuates. It's going up and down. The unemployment rate is not something that just stays level. And one of the things we know about the unemployment rate, of course, is that when we see it decline, like these areas you here have in blue, remember that declines in unemployment, that means that more people are getting jobs. So one of the things that we know is whenever the inflation rate increases, we know that unemployment falls, Phillips curve. So what you could say then is, you know that in these areas in blue, those are time periods in which we saw inflation within the economy. We saw money being added into the system because we can tell really quickly that there's a greater demand for goods. Why? Because unemployment falls. But at the same time, when you look at the areas in red, these are areas when unemployment was increasing. Now, from a Phillips curve perspective, whenever unemployment decreases, it's a result of deflation, the opposite of inflation, prices going down. So in this sense, we see here, unemployment is going up. People are losing jobs, whereas the blue areas tell us that people are gaining jobs. So over the last 30 years, you hit a rate of 9.8% to a low of 4%. Now you think about that, 4% in 2001. So essentially what we're saying here is that 2000 and 2001, the unemployment rate was as low as 4% of the population. So a lot of people had jobs. But then you look at this 9.8%, which in 1981 and in 2011, 2012, we had an unemployment rate of almost 10% of that population, of that labor force. So this is fluctuating constantly. And we're going to talk about why that is in this lesson. Okay, we're going to look at unemployment and inflation rates. So we're going to test Phillips curve. So when we first look at our unemployment rate, the last half of this should look familiar because we just looked at it on the slide. Basically, we just went back further into 1947. And so we see that it's fluctuating. Now the question is, are those fluctuations a result of changes in the money supply? Whenever the money supply changes, that's what we get. So increased money supply means inflation. The red line there should be increasing. Decreased money supply would create deflation. We're taking money out of the economy, making money more valuable. That should cause the unemployment rate to skyrocket. So let's look at deflation. So here, 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 here. These are all areas when deflation has occurred and unemployment has risen. Same thing here in 92 and again in 2002. We see that the unemployment rates are going up when the inflation rate, which of course deflation, is occurring in the economy. And again, had 2009. Deflation occurred, and as a result, unemployment rose. So Phillips curve is holding true. Now, when we look at the red areas, same principle. What we're seeing here, of course, in our red is these are instances in which inflation increased. So we see a rise in the supply of money, prices going up, causing unemployment to go down temporarily. So Phillips' case does hold true, except it doesn't all the time. In some instances, you see areas in which you see an increase in inflation and an increase in unemployment. For example, right here, you've got inflation increasing. Unemployment rate is increasing as well. You see some instances in which you've got these patterns, which Phillips curve does not always hold true. That's one of the things we'll talk about as we get more into our context of what we're looking at, is when Phillips curve isn't true. So that kind of gives you an idea that on the majority of the times Phillips curve does hold true, that inflation will cause the unemployment rate to go down and deflation will cause it to go up. Okay, to 2012 unemployment rate per state by percentage. So now we want to look at the states, and this gets a little more interesting. So what we're going to look at here is get an idea of is, notice that red line. That red line is 8.1%, and that was basically the line of 2012's annual unemployment rate. So in 2012, unemployment hovered around 8.1% annually. So this gives you an idea. So this is each state. So states in red are well below the national unemployment rate. In other words, those states had a lot of jobs. The states in blue, you can see all of those. You notice those, I have a few of them that go over 8.1, but the green ones are the ones that stand out because these are the areas which had the largest unemployment rate. So for example, Nevada had an unemployment rate that was over 13% when the rest of the country was just over 8%. So if in 2012 you lived in a state here in green, which included Tennessee, you'll see that their unemployment rate is higher than the national average, which means there were more people who were without jobs in those states than there were in others. For example, North Dakota had the lowest unemployment rate at just over 3%. So in North Dakota, only 3% of those people finding a job couldn't do it, whereas in Tennessee, that number is over 9%. You know, and North Dakota is very, very low, and in Nevada, now I can tell you right now, if you were to look at the population changes, you would probably see a lot of people leaving Nevada in the year of 2012 and moving to other states around them trying to find jobs. So we'll look at the labor force participation rate, and we're looking at this time period 1948 to 1975. So when we move, what you'll notice here is we've got this line, and you can see this is for women. So women in the workforce have been steadily increasing. In 1948, it was just over 30%. By 2012, it's just a shade under 60%. But you look at men in the labor force, though. Notice the labor force participation rate for men was almost 90% in 1948, but has fallen to just over 70%. So there has been a decrease in the labor force participation rate for men and an increase for women. And then, of course, the national average kind of stayed in the same, and it probably would. It's going to function some. Now, one of the things you'll notice with the labor force participation rate is that it's going to rise and fall based on the number of people within the labor force. For give you an example of this, if there are a lot of jobs out there, that labor force participation rate is going to increase, because if people start getting jobs, some people who were not in the labor force will join the labor force. If a lot of people are unemployed, if there aren't many jobs out there, what will happen is the labor force is going to drop. And the reason is because some people who are in the market who are looking for a job can't find it, and they simply give up looking. Well, they no longer count towards the labor force at that point. But what's interesting is how women have been increasing and men have been decreasing. And like one of the things we said, this has an awful lot to do with education, with the obtaining of skills. Because remember now, when we're talking about gaining access to jobs, we're talking about human capital. And the single biggest thing about human capital is the ability to obtain skills. Well, what this is telling me is that there were more women obtaining skills than there were men. And as a result, women were getting more jobs than men. Now, men still have a higher income, and that's something else we have to look at. But more women are gaining access to the workforce than men are. Okay, so now what we're going to do is look at unemployment rate by a couple of different categories here for 2012: age, race, ethnicity, and then gender. You'll need to remember that the unemployment rate in 2012, we saw it was like around just over 8.1%. So when we go through here and we look at age, you'll see 25 to 34, and then we look at our age ranges. Notice that the lowest unemployment rate is among the 55 to 64-year-old group, and the highest is at the 25 to 34. Now, I can tell you one of the major reasons why this is because people are choosing to work longer into their lives, which means there are fewer entry-level jobs at the bottom. So one of the problems with 25 to 34-year-olds finding jobs is the fact that there just aren't enough jobs opening up, because people are choosing to work later into life. And it's a lot of times why you see companies and stuff, what they'll do is they'll do these big payouts in an attempt to get people to retire early so they can lower their cost and hire entry-level individuals at a cheaper rate. Now, our next one, we're going to look at this race and ethnicity, and we'll look at this, of course, for 4 major groups within America. So first, we're going to look at the white population, then white males, and then white females. So notice overall, whites are well below. They're at 7.1%, with the national average about 8.1%. White males have more unemployment than white females. We should expect that because of the labor force participation rate. We know that, of course, since it's been in decline for males, therefore females are gaining more access to jobs. So the unemployment rate is going down for females while increasing for males. Now, when we move to looking at African American population, we see something very different. And also, of course, this is going to be very troubling. If you notice, at almost 14% of the black population is unemployed, well above the national average. And that goes even further for males, but not as much for females. And we should expect that. Now, the issue here is that 15% of black males in America, in the labor force, are unemployed and can't find a job. So that would suggest possibly that there could be job discrimination taking place possibly in some areas, but the fact of the matter is that number needs to go down. So there needs to be a way, something would need to take place in 2012 and going forward, of course, that would decrease unemployment for minorities in America. Because what we're going to see, of course, is the minorities in America have much higher unemployment rates than do the white population. When we look at Asian, you'll notice it's much lower. One of the biggest reasons here, of course, is because Asian families, in terms of an education and how they're pushing them to gain these access, they're not simply stopping at bachelor's degrees. These are Asian Americans are getting master's degrees, they're getting PhDs, they're getting advanced degrees, and that's, of course, is opening up more and more jobs. When we get to Hispanic, once again, we see the increase above the national average. Of course, Hispanic females lower than Hispanic males. That's what we would expect. But notice, of course, that both Hispanic and black minorities are much higher than the national average and much higher than the white population. So when you look at these types of numbers, you can get the idea of, okay, if unemployment is really, really going to go down, then you've got to find a way to get minorities access to more jobs. Okay, now we see this minimum wage. Minimum wage, of course, is designed to increase the standard of living. The thing about it is, when we look at this, hours at minimum wage needed to afford rent. In other words, what this says is that there's pretty much not a place in this entire country in which minimum wage is what equals a living wage, which is what it takes to actually live for a week. So you'll notice, in fact, that you see 70 hours or less above 88 hours. So you have these different areas within the United States. That's how much extra work people would have to do living on minimum wage. In other words, the average minimum wage employee needs to really work 2 jobs in order to actually be able to afford 2-bedroom rent at market pricing, which is the exact reason, of course, why you see the government using rent controls to bring rents down to close this gap with a minimum wage and a living wage. Okay, let's take a little closer look here at this unemployment rate and really kind of get into looking at the specifics behind it. So unemployment is divided into 2 categories. You have a long-run problem, which is the natural rate of unemployment. So the natural rate of unemployment is the amount of unemployment that the economy normally experiences. In other words, there's always unemployment. There's never 0% unemployment, and we'll look at why that is. So in other words, we never have 100% of the labor force employed. However, the natural unemployment rate, if the unemployment meets the natural rate, in other words, if short-term unemployment reaches that long-run problem, then we're looking at 100% employment. So this rate does not go away even over long periods of time. So there is always a natural rate of unemployment that fluctuates. Now, it's made up of frictional unemployment, seasonal unemployment, and structural unemployment, and we'll talk about what those are, of course. And then we have a short-run problem, which is the cyclical rate. What we want is for the cyclical rate to equal the natural rate. When the cyclical rate matches that natural rate, when those two are equal, we consider that full employment. So in other words, we know we're not going to have every person working, but if that cyclical rate can meet the natural rate, then that's where we want to be. So the cyclical rate of unemployment refers to the year-to-year fluctuation in employment around its natural rate. In other words, it's moving up and down around the natural rate of unemployment. So it fluctuates above and below the natural rate. So when we look at this natural rate of unemployment, so this is it. So this is the natural rate of unemployment from 1949 all the way up into you'll see here way up at 2023 there. So it's going way up. Now, you'll notice it's 5.25% more or less in 1949. It reaches a peak around 1981 at just over 6.25, and then it drops. So, here we have a natural rate of unemployment that has been increasing. In other words, if the natural rate of unemployment has been increasing, then there are fewer jobs. Here it was decreasing. So we see a decreasing natural rate of unemployment. More people were getting jobs. We had a stale, then it went up again. From 2007 to 2000 and to 2011, we saw unemployment rising again, and then declining again. We expect it to be declining again here into the future. So this is the natural rate of unemployment that we see within the economy. So a cyclical rate would be fluctuating above and below these numbers. So the question, of course, is why is there a natural rate of unemployment? Why is this occurring? So there's never a period of 0% unemployment. Millions of people are leaving and entering the job market each month. So we see as millions of people enter and leave, that's going to cause it to fluctuate. Probably because of resignations, because of layoffs, because of retirement, because of firings. We see people moving in and out of the job market. We call this frictional unemployment. So in addition to the movement of individuals in and out of the workforce, another major factor is the creation and destruction of jobs. In other words, jobs are being created and destroyed within the economy on a year-to-year, month-to-month basis as well, creating fluctuations. So the effect of Phillips curve is an example of this factor. So when inflation increases, so when there's an increase in the money supply, we're going to see the creation of jobs. So inflation creates jobs, deflation destroys jobs. So whenever those two factors are occurring, we see unemployment increasing and decreasing, and that's of course because of how the money supplies work. So that's the creation and destruction of jobs, and that's frictional unemployment. So the end result is that both firms and laborers are working to match applicants with openings. In other words, there's constant process to try to find a worker to match a job. And frictional unemployment arises from transaction costs accrued during this matching process. In other words, it takes time to find a person to fit with each job. Okay, in addition, we have a second reason for a natural rate of unemployment, and that's structural unemployment. So structural unemployment occurs when labor skills do not meet the requirements for job openings. So in other words, if we have a whole lot of workers and they're all trying to apply for the same job and they're not skilled enough, well, guess they're not going to get the job. So this is in reference to skills, the obtaining of skills to work in those jobs. If there were 10 positions open for some extremely advanced job, but only 9 people were qualified, then that means one job is going to be unfilled. So this is typically the result of technological improvement or geographic movement. Structural unemployment has a longer lasting effect on the natural rate of unemployment because of this. If technology increases, one of the things it does is it eliminates low-skilled jobs, but it creates new jobs to maintain that technology, to build that technology. And it takes time to find people to work in those jobs. Also, in terms of geographic movement, if you move a lot of people out of one area and into another, or you move a firm from one area to another, then becomes that question of finding individuals to work that job. So we have to have this development of labor skills. That takes time. The relocation of capital goods takes time. And so the primary cause of structural unemployment itself is job rationing. In other words, what we see happen is that the number of jobs out there is being rationed out for various reasons. It's a situation that arises when the wage rate is above the market equilibrium. So job rationing doesn't occur at minimum wage. It occurs at wages that are above minimum wage. So we have 3 causes for this: minimum wages, efficiency wages, and unions. And those 3 things there all create job rationing. And so we'll look at each one of those. So we'll look at how minimum wages cause structural unemployment. Minimum wages create unemployment in unskilled labor markets because, of course, these are markets at which the skill level is very, very low. And a binding floor prevents wages below the set amount. So when you look at it here, you can see the demand for labor at a minimum wage of $7.25 and the supply of labor. And you'll notice there's an unemployment amount. So as that minimum wage increases, that unemployment grows, the surplus grows. So it creates a surplus of labor in the market above equilibrium. And the result is the rationing jobs, and it's an increase or that surplus amount in that unemployment level every time the minimum wage is increased. Teen laborers are hit hardest by this because they have the lowest amount of skills and also the smallest amount of work time available. Okay, let's look at the efficiency wages and unemployment. So efficiency wages are those paid above equilibrium by firms in order to increase worker productivity. So efficiency wage theory. Firms may be better off keeping wages above equilibrium. So why is this? The answer is that efficiency wages create better worker health. Higher paid employees eat better, have fewer illnesses, thus they miss less work, and that makes them more productive. The better a worker is paid, the less likely they are to leave the firm and find a job at a competing firm, which means if that were to happen, you end up having to retrain that worker. Higher wages lead workers to be more productive because it increases their productivity. And also that, of course, leads them to the fear of being fired. Higher wages attract a better qualified pool of applicants to choose from. And that's a big deal because that means that you are gaining access to more skilled workers, and there's less of those available. Okay, so let's look at unions and their effect on unemployment. Unions are associations of workers that bargain with firms over wages, benefits, and working conditions. So they're bargaining to increase these things. They collectively bargain this with the firm. So you have a group on one side of the firms, you have a group on another, opposition and employees. They're both fighting back and forth to create a collectively bargained upon benefit program. Since unions bargain for wages above the market equilibrium, it's going to create a surplus of labor, typically 20 to 25% higher than non-union workers. And so the effect is the same as the minimum wage and efficiency wage, and the fact that now you have labor costs being above equilibrium, and that, of course, is creating a surplus of surplus of people looking for jobs. Okay, so our next question here is job rationing and negative. So there exists a trade-off in the market for labor. The use of job rationing increases the natural rate of unemployment, and that is a negative, but it increases the standard of living, so it is a positive in that sense. So when you look at this natural rate of unemployment, one of the things we notice is that minimum wages create labor surpluses, as do efficiency wages and as do unions. They increase the surplus amount of people looking for jobs, but they decrease the number of jobs available, and that causes that natural rate of unemployment to go up and down. So we see this increases the wage for unskilled workers, but it does not necessarily mean that it's a living wage. So even though we're increasing the standard of living, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're actually really making it a living wage. And as one of the things you've seen in every single state, minimum wage does not equal a living wage. So job rationing increasing wages. The supply of labor rises because as the wages go up, more and more people want jobs, but the demand for labor falls. So we're more productive, but fewer employees because of efficiency wages. So we see what's happening. And so is job rationing necessarily a negative? From the standpoint of creating unemployment, yeah, but from the standpoint of increasing the standard of living, the answer to that one is no. And of course, we can go back to this map and we can look at it again, and what we notice is that minimum wages in each state on average are not enough to live on. So we go back to this question of is job rationing a negative? So well, part of that, of course, is our unions bad? Some people say yes, some people say no. It's all about who you ask. From a historical standpoint, unions have forced firms to increase wages, create benefits for employees, improve working conditions. So it's hard to find a problem with that. Where people get into an issue is as to how unions have brought about that change. What have they done to create that? Strikes, different things. For example, you had an issue one year where the people who worked for airlines wanted to go on strike. Well, you can imagine the damage that would do to the country's transportation and commercial cost and all the things that were going on. And so that gets a very negative reaction for a lot of unions. And so some people would argue that today unions create more problems than they solve. That's not an issue that we want to discuss, though. So our third factor here is seasonal unemployment. So some jobs are based solely on the time of the year in which they're being used. The Mall Santa, for example, is a good one. Bureau of Labor Statistics provides unadjusted and seasonally adjusted unemployment statistics specifically because of this factor. So now let's look at the cyclical rate. Remember, this is the one that fluctuates above and below the national rate of unemployment. So cyclical unemployment is the fluctuating unemployment that occurs during the business cycle as recessions occur and raise employment rates, and while expansions decrease unemployment rates. So when you look at it here, you see the trend line that's moving upward. That trend line is basically real GDP over time. So in other words, the trend is that our real GDP over time is going to increase, and we'll talk about what real GDP is here shortly. And then we see the business cycle, which moves and fluctuates above and below it. And essentially in the short term, what we're saying is that in the short term, GDP rises and falls, unemployment rises and falls, inflation occurs, deflation occurs, but in the long run trend, everything tends to be moving in an upward trend. So we're going to look at the relationship between the natural rate of unemployment rate and the unemployment rate itself. So let's put these two together. So over the long term, here's our natural rate of unemployment. Then you'll notice the cyclical, which is moving above and below it, and it's just crazy. The times where it's closest to the blue line, that's when we're in our best position. That's when we're almost at full employment. So you'll notice it's going up and down, it's going up and down. We see these huge peaks, we see these huge drops. So here's the cyclical unemployment rate fluctuating around this natural rate of unemployment.